Mexico's incoming president now insisting that Canada remain a part of Nafta. That is according to Reuters. Reuters also reporting that AMLO and Trudeau spoke over the phone on Thursday and that AMLO said there is still time for a deal. Now, this news comes as the U.S. and Mexico are set to release the text of their two-way deal tonight. They're releasing that text because they so far have been unable to reach a compromise with Canada. But Reuters saying that AMLO believes that once he takes office, Canada should be eventually forced to come on board. Back over to you.
Elon, thank you for the update. And I guess, guys, the significance of this would be it goes against, if it's true, it goes against President Trump's strategy to just go straight bilateral with Mexico to put the pressure on Canada to have to join some sort of trade deal. Exactly. If Mexico's insisting it's trilateral, it means they're not going to cut Canada out. Right.
And of course, Congress was somewhat resistant to that idea of just doing a Mexican deal, it seemed at first. And also there was the kind of maybe artificial timetable of the Mexican leadership shift, right? That was going to be easy to get ratified. So it definitely complicates.
To me, it illustrates this notion, going back a few months, that trade wars are easy to win. If you can't even get Canada, who's your one of your biggest, if not our biggest trading partner, on what should be a relatively straightforward agreement, if you can't even reach that with them, then what are the prospects for really kind of renegotiating something bigger with China?
Elon, you mentioned there that AMLO had a phone call with Prime Minister Trudeau. How optimistic do you think that was, not just in terms of the tone between them, but the tone that they expect, as is possible, between the U.S. and Canada to make a deal?
Well, we don't have a lot more details about that phone call right now, Wilfred. But what I do want to point out is that Reuters is also reporting that AMLO said he will not reopen the negotiations between the U.S. and Mexico. So this is really about trying to give assurances to Canada that it won't be left out in the cold at the end of the day.
I would just say that as far as the market's concerned, Mike, none of this matters. I mean, this is a lot of politics, and it could really impact our diplomatic relationships with our best friends like Canada. But ultimately, this is not a market that is showing any worry about the breakup of NAFTA, is it?
It's not in a very specific way. You would see it in isolated place. Look, the U.S. auto stocks are awful. There's definitely Canada risk in those names. If you look at,
the fact that the president has threatened tariffs on autos coming in.
The rails that are exposed to the Mexican routes are badly underperforming, Kansas City Southern, right, versus the other ones. So in isolated pockets, yes, but in aggregate, no. People say the math doesn't get to that level of having to worry as much about it yet.
Elon, if we sum up the week as a whole, the tone from President Trump towards Canada when he gave various comments throughout the week, but particularly that Wednesday night, I think it was, extended press conference, doesn't give much hope or much optimism between the U.S. and Canada at the moment.
I think that the important thing is, how does Trudeau feel about this, right? And he said his goal throughout this has been not to escalate any tension. So he's letting President Trump set that tone, sometimes positive, sometimes not. He doesn't want to make matters any worse.
There's this old line about trade negotiations that all the real action happens at 1 minute before midnight. Well, the deadline for Canada to join a U.S.-Mexico trade deal, which could replace NAFTA, is like midnight tonight. Negotiators from the three countries are racing against the clock to try and get a deal done. Foreign Affairs Minister FREELAND delayed her big speech at the United Nations yesterday to stay in Ottawa for 11th-hour consultations at the Prime Minister's office. The stakes are really high and made higher by the public sniping of Donald Trump, which we heard more of last night.
We've reached a deal to replace the horrible NAFTA, one of the worst trade deals ever, with a brand new U.S.-Mexico trade deal. And we'll see what happens with Canada.
We'll see. When the NAFTA negotiations began, Trudeau and FREELAND tried a charm offensive on the U.S., but increasingly, Canada's been playing hardball. While Donald Trump has been pushing a U.S.-Mexico deal, threatening a new auto tariffs on Canada, huge, Trudeau and FREELAND have dug in, even stalling negotiations for 2 weeks.
The justification under your rules for the imposition of these tariffs was a national security consideration. So what you are saying to us and to all of your NATO allies is that we somehow represent a national security threat to the United States. And I would just say to all of Canada's American friends, and there are so many, seriously?
Yeah, that's a huge deal for Freeland. And then things started to change actually quite dramatically. On Thursday, Trudeau called the incoming Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, and they agreed to tell Trump that Canada must be included in the deal. Team Canada, as Freeland likes to refer to them, has now gambled that it can get a better deal by staring down the deadline. But with the clock ticking, there's a lot at stake. Joining me is Patrick Leblanc. He's a professor of international affairs at the University of Ottawa. Joining me is Patrick Leblanc. He is a professor of international affairs at the University of Ottawa. So, Patrick, Donald Trump is still playing hardball here. The stakes are huge. Can you outline for us what this could mean for Canada's economy if there is no deal?
Well, if there is no deal, there are two things that are threatened by the Trump administration and Mr. Trump itself. One is actually a pullout of the United States from Nafta, so Canada would lose its free trade access to the U.S. market. The second part is that the Americans would also impose tariffs, either 10 or 25% is not clear, on the auto sector.
And of course, there's lots of talk of possible concessions on the dairy industry. That could be a massive effect on dairy farmers in Quebec in particular, where half of that industry is. But I wanted to talk to you too about how there's been quite a change in approach from Team Canada towards Donald Trump. At first, there seemed to be a charm offensive. Lately, it seems they've been prepared to stare down this deadline. What do you think of the handling of the way that Canada has chose to handle the negotiations the last couple of weeks, this tougher approach?
Well, I don't think the approach is actually that much tougher than it was from the beginning. I think the Canadian side always welcomed the opportunity to renegotiate NAFTA. They always said, look, we want a good deal. We want to modernize NAFTA. We're negotiating good faith. But we're not going to accept the bullying by the United States. We're not going to accept a bad deal for Canada because this is something that we would have to live with for a very long time. But certainly at first, we tried to be nice and everything. And then with more and more pressures, all these deadlines that have been imposed on Canada, like this is the final deal that you can get. Otherwise, the Canadians have just kept they're cool and going forward and really testing in a way all this bluffing and huffing and puffing, if you want, from the U.S. side. And so far it seems that the strategy is working. And of course, at the same time, there was a lot of engagement by Canada on the U.S. side, trying to build allies and a coalition to support us. And I think to some extent we're seeing some of that pressure playing out now and not kind of freaking out or panicking in front of the threats by Mr. Trump.
Well, they say everything happens a minute to midnight, and I remember from the first free trade agreement back in the late 80s that they actually stopped the clock, so it could go past midnight. Well, I'll be watching this. Patrick, thank you so much for talking to us this morning.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Wendy.
Well, for more on this breaking news, we're joined by CTV's Glenn McGregor, who is at the United Nations. Glenn, this is quite the turn of events. Yesterday, you were talking about Chrystia Freeland giving basically the biggest speech of her career, and now it's the biggest deal of her career, or that's taking top spot. So what exactly are you hearing?
Well, obviously, that's the priority. The NAFTA negotiations more important than her speech to the UN General Assembly, which is pretty much almost shut down now because we're late in the week. All the major leaders spoke earlier in the week, and so Canada's slot was not a great one. So not much of a loss there, and it really is unclear who will deliver that speech on Monday or if it'll be delivered at all. Obviously, government's priority is getting a NAFTA deal before this U.S.-imposed deadline, which is tomorrow evening. But of course, Congress doesn't sit on the weekend, so we were expecting the U.S. and the Mexicans to release a full text of their agreement last night without Canada signing on to it. That has been delayed. Also, looks like the Mexicans and the Americans are willing to at least wait until the end of the weekend and see if there's any chance that Canada could sign on again. But one of the complications is the Quebec election next week. That is something that is factoring into this in a big way, especially if Canada's signing on to this deal requires concessions affecting Quebec's dairy industry. That would be a political bombshell right before people in Quebec go to vote, and it's very likely the Canadian side would like to wait until after that happens, but it's quite possible that just isn't in the cards, and that there could be maybe a deal announced tomorrow, maybe Monday, maybe Tuesday, we don't know. The fact that Freeland is back in Canada, you could read that a couple of ways. If Canada was to have achieved an agreement, maybe they would want to announce it from Ottawa. Maybe they'd want to be in Washington. We don't know. So everything's really in flux right now, but it's clear that, Angie, that things are coming right down to the wire into the final hours heading up to tomorrow night.
Oh, my goodness. It's like trying to follow the bouncing ball. We have no idea which way it's going to go now. Recently, I mean, this week, Trudeau spoke with the president-elect of Mexico talking about salvaging this three-country agreement. What more do we know about that conversation?
Yes, the President-elect Obrador is saying that he is going to honor any agreement that was made by his predecessor, Enrique Peña Nieto. So that would include the deal with the Americans. So that would suggest that the Mexicans are willing to extend the deadline further so that the text doesn't get signed before the new president takes over. It would be sometime after, but he would respect the deal made previously, and that would give Canada a bit more time to keep negotiating, to keep this thing going, the talks going into next week, maybe Tuesday, maybe Wednesday. We just don't know. I mean, we've heard so many rumors, Angie, about this over the past few months that a deal was imminent so many times, and then it never seems to happen. So we have to be a little bit cautious here about what this actually means. This deadline really doesn't affect Canada directly because Congress is required to approve a three-way deal, and the fact that the Mexicans and the U.S. are going to submit a two-way deal, it's unclear if Congress would approve that. We've heard conflicting signs from congressmen, from senators and representatives in the House about whether they would do that. That was sort of Canada's stopgap position, that Congress would save them if they hadn't signed on before this deadline. We still don't know if that's the case. Again, just tremendously in flux, so many balls in the air right now, and not a lot of clarity coming from Minister Freeland's office yet about exactly what's happening in the next 12, 18, 24 hours.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll keep watching. And Glenn, I certainly appreciate you trying to sort of divulge, go through all those bouncing balls and juggle it for us, if you will. Glenn McGregor reporting to us from the United Nations. Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks.
Welcome back. A deadline arrives today for Canada to sign on to a new Nafta deal with the United States. Joining me right now in an exclusive interview is Peter Navarro, Assistant to the President and Director of the White House Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. Peter, it's good to see you this morning. Thanks so much for joining me. Are we close with Canada?
I just spoke an hour ago to the team, and I'm going to update you on that. But I do want to say one thing before we go to Canada. It's simply this, that President Donald J. Trump has very quietly been putting together the best performance on the economy and trade of any president in modern history. And it's really, truly extraordinary. And I say quietly because the media has underreported both the actions we've taken and the results. And Exhibit A is this last week at the United Nations, where President Trump orchestrated a groundbreaking deal with South Korea, opened negotiations with Japan, and worked with our allies in Japan and Europe to issue strong statements against the behavior of China.
Peter,
so
let me interrupt you. I know you had a fantastic week in terms of trade. We only have a few minutes this morning because we've had such a breaking news program. I want to get to the meat and potatoes, if you will. One of the issues was the so-called Chapter 19 dispute panels. The U.S. wants to eliminate from NAFTA. Canada wants to preserve. Has that been agreed upon?
Here's where things stand. The broad brush of the deal is two things. One is that we want to restore North America as a manufacturing powerhouse by reclaiming the supply chain. The deal in principle with Mexico will do that. If Canada comes in, that's great. There's also a modernization component that brings in things like protection for digital IP, pharma, and things like that. That's where things stand. There's broad agreement on virtually all of that. There are several sticking points. You mentioned one, dairy's another. The last thing I want to do is sit here and interject anything into this debate. Let Bob Lighthizer and his colleagues in these other countries get the job done today. And I promise you this, Maria, tomorrow morning on Maria in the Morning, you'll have some news one way or another that'll be big and perhaps market moving.
So then we are close then. You think we could see a Canada deal by tomorrow morning when Mornings with Maria starts on Fox Business, is what you're saying?
Everybody's negotiating in good faith right now as we speak, and the deadline is midnight tonight to get the text in to Congress in order to make sure this goes forward. So it's either going to be the text goes in with Mexico and the U.S. or the text goes in with all three countries.
At the same time, the president's working with the Europeans and Japan very quickly, correct?
Japan and Europe on a united front against China's forced technology transfer, which this action this week described as deplorable. Within the Nafta, the new agreement with Mexico and Canada, there's very strong provisions against the state-owned enterprise behavior of China.
And that is new, a united front against China. Peter, thanks very much for weighing in. It is good to see you this morning.
Chrystia Freeland was supposed to address the UN General Assembly today. Instead, she has canceled, citing the difficult NAFTA talks taking place this weekend. It was meant to be a high-profile speech, part of Canada's effort to raise its profile on the world stage. This as our country fights for a seat at the Security Council. The CBC's Melissa Kent is at the UN with more on Freeland's postponement.
Well, this is what we know. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, was scheduled to speak today. At around 11 a.m., we received word that Canada had switched its speaking slot for Monday. And we were told that it was because of the ongoing NAFTA negotiations. Then CBC learned that because of those trade talks, it's quite likely not going to be Minister Freeland delivering Canada's keynote address on Monday to the UN General Assembly. It could be the ambassador here, Marc-André Blanchard, or another minister. Chrystia Freeland is, of course, the minister leading Canada's NAFTA negotiations team. She cut short her trip to Europe last month to travel to Washington for this latest phase of the talks, and has been in Washington every week until this week, when she was here in New York for the annual UN General Assembly. She returned to Canada Thursday evening, and what we're being told is that for now, there are no plans for her to return to Washington, but that she is actively engaged in the ongoing negotiations, and that for now, she'll be doing that by phone from Ottawa. Canada has been saying from the start that it would not be pressured into a deal that is bad for Canada, that it was looking for a good deal, not just any deal. And of course, these negotiations have led to some well-publicized remarks by U.S. President Trump, disparaging the Prime Minister and the negotiating team.
And our thanks to Melissa Kent at the United Nations in New York. Well, the federal government's decision to postpone Freeland's speech shows how crucial this weekend is in terms of NAFTA talks. The U.S. wants a deal done by Sunday night, but Freeland and the Prime Minister have said repeatedly that they will not sign an agreement that's not good for Canadians. Brian Stewart is a foreign affairs expert, also a former CBC senior correspondent, and he says the whole world is watching these NAFTA talks.
I think Canadians tend to underestimate just how much media play, attention, this is getting around the world. For all number of countries are saying to themselves, if America can turn around and treat its oldest friend, its neatest friend this way, what can it do to us down the road? So there's a great interest from China all the way through Europe in how Canada will handle this moment. An enormous pressure on our Prime Minister and on Freeland.
Donald Trump has made it known, without naming her, that he's not crazy about Chrystia Freeland. How would you assess her time as foreign minister? Because some people would think that perhaps she should use more kid gloves, considering how crucial a time, as you say, we are in right now.
Yes, there is true. There is a body that thinks she spreads herself too thin and uses strong language. There's another body, her enormous admirers, that think she's the most outstanding foreign minister in the world today and really should speak a punch above Canada's weight in the ring, and she's very happy to do that.
Joining me now is Transportation Minister Marc Garneau, chair of the Cabinet Committee on Canada-U.S. Relations. Minister, today is the deadline for NAFTA, and you still have no deal. Why not?
We're not working towards a deadline. We're working towards a deal that is good for Canada. We've said that from the beginning. We've been very constructive in these negotiations, and we're going to continue to do so. And we believe that there is the potential to have a win-win-win for all three countries of the NAFTA.
Now, I know today you said earlier, you said that you're not concerned about the deadline there. And on Friday, you said that there is no real deadline. But that's never been a line by the Liberal government before. At some point, don't you run into a deadline?
We have always said right from the beginning that we wanted to have a deal, but not any deal. It has to be a deal that is good for Canada. And we are negotiating that deal. That is the #1 priority, that we end up with a deal that is good for Canada and hopefully for the other two countries.
Now, I know that the government likes to say we're only going to accept a good deal. We'd rather have no deal than a good deal. But how would be a situation where there are millions in tariffs, where you're looking at potentially losing thousands of jobs and market access to the U.S., how is that preferable to a deal where it's not an ideal situation for you?
Look, we know each other's positions. We know the things that matter to Canada. We will make that very clear to the United States. They know our position, and we will stick to those positions because they are important for our country. This isn't the nature of negotiations. The easy parts get done at first, and in the end, you have to work out the more difficult parts. We know exactly what is important for Canada, and we're going to continue to negotiate so that we hold on to a good deal for Canada.
But are you willing to keep dairy protection and the dispute settlement mechanism, to keep pushing for that at the risk of tariffs, which economists say would put the Canadian economy into a significant recession all across this country?
We're conscious of all the factors that play into this, but at the end of the day, Canadians want us to come up with a deal that is good for Canada. And there are a lot of things that have to be negotiated and have to be discussed and agreements arrived at. And we're very conscious of all that. And we have, from the beginning, made constructive proposals to find a deal that works out for all three countries. And we will continue to do so because for us, it has to be a good deal for Canadians.
But Minister, with all due respect, you're not answering the question of whether you're willing to take the risk of tariffs here, because no deal risks tariffs, and that risks a national recession.
And what I'm telling you is that what we end up with has to be a good deal that covers everything, and that's the position that we've taken from the beginning, and that's what we're going to do right up until we
So does that mean that you're willing to take the risk of auto tariffs?
That covers everything. You have to look at the whole picture, and that is what we've done from the beginning, and that's what we're going to continue to do because there are a lot of interests at play here, and we are looking at all of those so that we end up with something that is good for Canada.
Are you willing to risk auto tariffs, which I think all economists will tell you would not be good for Canada?
I'm not going to negotiate in front of the camera here. We have an excellent team of negotiators. They are negotiating this deal in the interests of Canada, and Canadians support our approach to negotiations with the United States.
But will Canadians still support you if you don't get a deal and Mexico and the U.S. move ahead with their own, which is what both Mexico and the United States have said they'll do?
Canadians have told us that they want us to negotiate a good deal for Canada, and that's precisely what we've been doing from the beginning.
Well, Minister, I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you about the Governor General. You are a former astronaut. I'm sure that you know Governor General Payette. There's been a lot of criticism of her in the media over the past week, in particular, about the number of duties that she's engaged in, about the number of public appearances she's putting in and events that she's hosting. Is your government satisfied with her performance as Governor General?
I'm not going to comment on that question, Mercedes. I will tell you that the Governor General is a personal friend of mine. I have known her for a very long time. She is the head of state of our country, and I'm not going to give you my personal opinions on that subject.
But as a minister, are you concerned about whether, as you say, the head of state, one of the most important jobs in the country, is being fulfilled when reportedly the Governor General didn't want to make time in her schedule to sign off on the marijuana legislation on the day that it was passed?
I'm not going to comment on these things. I'm going to tell you that our Governor General is a role model for Canadians, particularly for young people who are interested in science. For women in general, and she is a personal friend of mine. So I'm not going to comment here on camera on anything else but that.
Okay, before we go, let's go back to NAFTA for just a moment then, Minister. Going forward, what is the primary message you're going to try to deliver to both the President and Congress about whether you have flexibility on this file?
We will continue to repeat to the NAFTA negotiators on the U.S. side that we want a good deal. These are the things that are important for us. The Americans also have things that are important for them. Let's try to find a deal here that will satisfy both of us. That's essentially the essence of negotiations. It's always been that way. And for us, it's essential that we continue to defend Canadian interests.
Okay, we'll see how all of this rolls out, putting a lot of faith in Congress there and in the negotiators. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Mercedes.
And Katie Simpson joins us now from Ottawa. And what happened on this story today, Katie?
It has been a day of dramatic developments behind the scenes, and we are just starting to get a better picture of exactly what happened. The U.S. and Mexico had planned to release the details of a renegotiated NAFTA without Canada sometime today, but that has been postponed because of an urgent push happening right now by Canada and the U.S. to keep this as a trilateral pact. Members of Mexico's Senate are being told the preliminary details of a three-way deal could be ready in the next 48 hours. Sources tell CBC News there have been high-level conversations all day and all week between the U.S. and Canada to see if they can reach a deal by the U.S.-imposed deadline of October 1st. Canada even reached out to Mexico's incoming president yesterday as well to ask the Mexicans to intervene on Canada's behalf and to promise that this would remain a three-way deal. The president-elect is supporting Canada, insisting that this be a trilateral pact.
I'm sure there are lots of issues, but what seems to be the biggest hang-up?
The biggest one continues to be Chapter 19, what is known as the Independent Dispute Resolution System. The U.S. wants to get rid of it. The system is a personal pet peeve of the U.S. Trade Representative. But negotiators from Canada and the U.S. have blamed each other for being stubborn on this issue. So right now, that again is the biggest point of tension.
And you'll be standing by all weekend, I know. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks.
Well, a tense day in the NAFTA talks. Efforts to reach a trade deal between Canada, Mexico, and the United States are up against a deadline imposed by the U.S. Washington wants an agreement by midnight, or it will go ahead with a deal it has already reached with Mexico. The CBC's Evan Dyer's in Ottawa. He joins us right now. So at this point, Evan, as we keep tracking these talks, what do we know about the negotiations? How are they going so far?
Well, there are some comments filtering out from people who are not directly in the negotiations, but among the group of labor and industry that is briefed by the government on the progress of negotiations that sound fairly optimistic, even talk of maybe reaching a deal this evening. But we're also hearing other signals that there are still major outstanding issues, and they include some of the issues that have been dogging these negotiations since they began. Chapter 19, dispute resolution being one of them. But there's also the threat of what might happen after an agreement, those other non-NAFTA related trade actions that the Trump administration has threatened Canada with before. Are they going to go away? That is obviously of great importance to Canada. Canada wants to know that when it makes a deal, that the deal is done and there are no swords hanging over its head. You know, we've heard some more positive language, I guess, coming from the U.S. side as well, particularly yesterday. We heard slightly less threatening language from President Trump at a rally in West Virginia, and also his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, who in the past has been well known for his inflammatory comments, went on Fox News, and he seemed to strike a slightly more positive tone as well. Let's watch him.
Tomorrow morning on Maria in the Morning, you'll have some news one way or another that'll be big and perhaps market moving. Everybody's negotiating in good faith right now as we speak, and the deadline is midnight tonight to get the text in to Congress in order to make sure this goes forward. So it's either going to be the text goes in with Mexico and the U.S., or the text goes in with all three countries.
So obviously he's leaving the door open to going ahead without Canada, but at the same time, I guess one could point out that he said everyone's negotiating in good faith. It seems like a very small reed to be grasping at, but bearing in mind that over the past week we've heard the president himself say that the White House doesn't like Canada's negotiating style or its lead negotiator. I guess you could say that that's a somewhat more positive kind of language we're hearing coming out of the White House today.
Absolutely. But you know, as I say, keep watching all of this, I'm wondering about sticking points here, because we are approaching this midnight deadline. What is essentially stopping a deal from being reached here?
Well, certainly going into this weekend, dairy supply management remained an issue. Whether that's been resolved or not, we don't know. But we do believe that Chapter 19 still remains to be resolved, that dispute resolution mechanism that allows Canada to go to a panel that would typically have 5 members, 3 from one country, 2 from another, instead of having to resolve disputes for its companies that are accused of dumping, for example, in U.S. domestic courts, where, at least in the early days of the free trade agreement, Canadians were concerned that they might not get a fair shake. That's one issue. Another issue, though, is what happens after this deal is signed. Canada wants to be able to sign this deal and say, okay, we now have free trade with the United States. There are not going to be other issues outside of NAFTA, like Section 232 tariffs. Those tariffs that the Trump administration imposed on Canada back in the spring for steel and aluminum, and that President Trump keeps on threatening to impose on Canadian cars and trucks. Most recently, in New York last week, he made that threat again. So what Canada wants is a guarantee that once NAFTA is signed, that threat of national security tariffs goes away. With Mexico, the U.S. resolved that with a side letter, but that side letter might not be satisfactory for Canada because it imposed export caps on Canada. Canada would ideally want to have a guarantee of no extra tariffs, no Section 232 tariffs, and no export caps.